We're going to discuss the tariffs further now with Mujtaba Rahman, who is a managing director of Europe at Eurasia Group. He joins us live now from London. Mujtaba, thank you so much for joining us on the program. Great to have you. So we're hearing a lot of voices obviously saying that this tariff and trade policy reshapes global order when it comes to trade. Give us some perspective on that. Is that truly the case? I mean, how is it going to affect everyday people like us?
I think it is a complete rewiring of the global trading system. The Trump administration believes in two things, and they believe those two things adamantly. Number one, they want to reshore manufacturing supply chains back to America, and they believe that the construction of tariff walls against all major trading partners is the vehicle to achieve it. And you've seen that, for example, in the deals, the framework deals that have been struck both with the European Union and the United Kingdom. Secondly, they believe tariffs are an accelerator for generating revenue that they are using to fund domestic tax cuts in the US. Now, given those two beliefs, I think the implications for the global trading system are indeed quite profound. The impact primarily will be felt on the American consumer because ultimately tariffs are a cost that will be borne by the US consumer. It is true that we are not seeing that reflected in the data today. But I think the consensus among economists is that over the medium term, there is no way that the creation of these tariff walls with all of these third countries will not ultimately impact domestic prices in the US.
That's exactly what I was going to ask you, because yes, this executive order says and vows to increase US revenue, but it is going to be the American people that have to foot the bill, and it does weaken their purchasing power, their everyday purchasing power. Would you agree?
I would agree in terms of the inflationary impact. Yes, that will have an impact on the purchasing power of American consumers. I think one thing to look at now, and that is absolutely the case in the trade agreement with the European Union, is where the exemptions fall. So Donald Trump is claiming that he has negotiated a new trading relationship with the EU. There is a 15% tariff wall, so all European goods exports to the US will be confronted by this 15% tariff wall. However, there are very important carve-outs for specific sectors. And so there are a lot of holes in this tariff wall. That's absolutely the case for the UK. It's also the case for the European Union. Understanding where those sector carve-outs are, which are those sectors that are not going to be confronted by a 15% tariff, but actually a tariff rate that is much lower, much more approximate to most favored nation tariff levels, will also be important in understanding the distributional implications domestically within the US for the US consumer.
Let's talk about some of the big news that's going on with Canada. Of course, they've now been hit by a 35% tariff. Prime Minister Carney had promised to resist Trump's economic force when he was elected to office. Ottawa has effectively failed to secure a deal, though. How do you see things there progressing? Do you see them progressing or not progressing?
I think it's very challenging. The problem, of course, in working with the US administration is trade discussions do not exist in a vacuum. But that was absolutely, again, the case for the European Union. There was a real concern in Brussels and EU capitals that if there was retaliation against Donald Trump's tariff moves, that could potentially negatively impact negotiations, for example, over Ukraine. It could potentially impact the US's willingness to be a guarantor and provider of European security. And so I think is the same issue with Canada. There are many issues around the border, obviously. Donald Trump has obviously also now said that Canada's in principle commitment to recognize Palestine, that is a constraint. And so that is part of the problem here. This isn't purely about trade flows in both directions. It is linked to a set of other issues that are also part of this very broad negotiation. And so I think the outlook for the US-Canada trading relationship, certainly in the short to medium term, is quite challenging.
You mentioned some of those political and those policy implications here from those other countries. Talk to us about how much of an impact this way of doing things has when, Trump is sort of using personal grievances, for example, with Brazil and the situation with Bolsonaro and his legal woes, using that to sort of drive tariffs. What sort of impact does that have when it's this sort of chaotic, haphazard strategy?
I think the fundamental implication is uncertainty. And I think in response to that uncertainty, you've effectively seen two strategies. One is the strategy, again, of the European Union, which is the one I'm closest to. That is to say, we need to lock in stability wherever we can, because this administration is weaponizing unpredictability as a negotiating tactic to its advantage. And so if there is a possibility to lock in an agreement on a 15% in principle tariff war, let's do it. And then we negotiate on the outstanding elements. There have been other countries and other parts of the world that have adopted a different strategy, which is to say, ultimately, the cost of what the administration is doing is going to be borne by the US consumer. Depending on the level of escalation and the size of the market in question, there may also be a corporate and a market implication for the US. We saw that certainly with respect to China. And so they're not willing to back down and concede and adopt that strategy, as I say, of the EU or indeed the UK, but instead want to kind of take the fight to Donald Trump, as it were. Now, of course, that is a quite risky strategy in light of all of the issues that are being linked by this administration and their willingness, and I think their tolerance, to assume some degree of domestic economic pain.
Well, I did want to talk to you about China because, as you said, they haven't sort of bended the knee, so to speak, to Trump. They have responded with aggressive tariffs of their own. Who do you think is winning in that war?
I mean, I don't think there's any winner, honestly, in a trade war with no uncertain outcome. Both sides are losers, but it is true that the Chinese playbook differed decisively from certainly the one, again, adopted in the European Union. I think the general sense is, given the size of the market, given of the Chinese market, given the importance of two-way trade, there was a lot of domestic corporate pressure and indeed pressure on US treasuries that forced the administration into a broader in principle agreement with the Chinese. And so that's where I say the size of the market, the strength of the market reaction, the extent of domestic corporate pressure on the US administration, these are factors that are also something of an ultimate constraint on the Trump's administration's willingness to escalate. And continue escalating in the context of a trade war.
Sorry, I'll let you finish your sentence there. It was really great talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us on Daybreak today.
Thanks for having me.